Hello, and welcome to yet another podcast. Now, ACE Your Assessments platform open to all of the students, and we hope you're enjoying it as much as possible. Please do send us any questions that you might have, and we could address them in future podcasts. Um, Today, we've got Dr. Alwyn Jones with us. Alwyn, welcome.
Thank you.
Um, you are an associate professor and you're involved with modules such as constitutional and admin law, human rights, immigration and refugee law, as well as social justice.
That's right.
And one interesting thing that you shared that you'd like your students to know, or you don't mind them to know, is that you once fell off a sailing boat in Rutland waters, and that taught you a very good lesson about learning. Do you want to tell us a little bit more
Yes,
about
yes.
that?
It may help if I explain this a bit, just in case people are worried about what I'm doing in my spare time. Uh, it occurred to me a few years ago that I'd never learned to sail a sailing boat. I thought that might be an interesting thing to try. So I arranged with a friend to go on a course, and obviously living in Leicester, we're a long way from the sea, so I went to the nearest large lake where you can learn to sail, which was Rutland Water. And we were taught in a classroom, how to manage a boat. We went out with the instructor and sat with him, and he'd talk us through, this is where you should be looking. This is how you learn which way the wind is coming from. Because I would always be holding on to the tiller at the back of the boat, steering and looking at the thing I'm holding, and I'm supposed to be looking to see which way the wind is going to make sure I can turn the boat to catch the wind in the sails and to propel us along very nicely. Then on the second day of the course, we had the chance to take out a small sailing boat on our own for the first time. And I was really excited by this. So I was turning the tiller to catch the wind and looking just at the trees to see which way the wind was blowing, when suddenly, when the sails caught the wind, the boat tipped over by 90 degrees. I was in the lake. Fortunately, my glasses were tied with a rope, and I was wearing a wetsuit because the water was cold. And I know how to swim, so it was fine. But, I was in the lake, the boat was on its side, and it was all right because I could just swim back and push it back up. Although it was
Mm.
quite difficult to do because the reason the boat had tipped over was I'd forgotten something I was meant to do, which the instructor had been very clear about, that when you leave the shore, there's a sort of centerboard, if you imagine it, a sort of wooden board in the middle of the boat. You're meant to push down. And
Yeah.
if you push it down, it goes through the hull and it stabilizes the boat. So when you catch the wind, it
Mm.
doesn't tip over and fall over on its side. So I'd forgotten to that. So I simply swam back to the boat, pushed the board through, tipped it back up, and sailed off properly. And the thing I learned about that was it was an embarrassing mistake at the time, but it reminded me that making mistakes is inevitable as a part of learning. So you might be coming to this podcast session maybe really frustrated because you tried really hard to follow the feedback from a previous assignment, maybe, and yet you got a disappointing mark. And my suggestion, for what it's worth, is that making mistakes is
Yes,
part of
what?
learning. It was embarrassing for me at the time, but I'm pretty sure I'm the only person now who remembers that happened. Apart from you now, of
Well,
course, you all know it, but that's okay.
yes, it's good. It's very good that you're sharing it, and now someone hopefully will make the same mistake and will learn from yours instead.
Yes, that's right. Yes, if you go sailing
It's
and
always
you're in a small boat, yep,
yes, it's always good to learn from someone else's mistakes.
that's right.
Sometimes we really do need to make our own, and then that will definitely stay with us for a very long time.
Hmm.
Um, and hopefully we do learn from feedback. And I think this is really why we're here today. We're here to talk about how to structure a law essay for maximum impact. And I suppose my first question to you, Owen, is why do you think this is such an important topic or such an important issue?
A good question to start us off with. I see this as a really important issue because something that seems to happen again and again is something similar to what I was describing, where people get a mark that's maybe okay, a middling mark, not like what you're aiming for. And for your next essay, you're determined to improve. So you work really hard, you stay late in the library, you look at all the materials, you read the feedback again, and you really work hard on this one. You hand it in thinking, surely this time I'll break through, I'll get a 2-1 or I'll get a first, and I wasn't before. And then maybe you get the mark back, and sometimes it's a huge disappointment because maybe it's only 1 mark up from the mark you got last time. People I know can find this enormously frustrating. And what I hope
Yes,
this session will do will be to clear away some of the fog and the kind of mystery about this. I think sometimes working out what to write or how to organize your essay can feel a bit like trying to do archery with a blindfold, where you feel like I'm not even sure where the target is. How am I supposed to hit it if I can't even see it? And it can feel like a very mysterious process. People can be unclear about what
that's
is our
true.
tutor
That's
wanting us
true.
to do.
I think the most popular question, I suppose, is the essay titles. They are all different because you're saying, of course, you're going to look at the feedback, but how do we learn? They're all individual, that you're not going to get the same assessment, obviously, unless you're resitting. Um, but you already have dealt with it. But what do we do generally? How do we understand the title? The requirement of what it is that the topic is at hand. How do we
Yes, good
unlock
point.
that?
Because, yes, thinking about the feedback on the previous essay, that might tell us how we could have or should have approached the last one. But obviously, the next essay title will be different, probably quite likely in a different module. When you're not clear, when students are not clear what the essay title is asking them to do, I can suggest a few things that you might try.
Mm,
One thing could be simply to see if you can write out the title in your own words as much as possible using different words than the title uses. Partly as a way to almost like the title is part of a lecture and you're making notes on it, if you see what I mean.
mm,
Because hopefully that will clarify, are there some aspects of the title which you are clear about? Are there some maybe which are ambiguous, which could mean different things to different people? And this can happen sometimes with a particular concept or an opinion. So the essay title might say that, say, the law in a particular area is on the right track, or it's fair, or it's consistent, or something like that. It's a good law. But obviously, people might have very different ideas about what is the right track for a particular area of law, what would make a good law on a particular issue. So
mm.
when you notice that kind of ambiguity, it's worth making a note of that. That could be useful. That could be part of the discussion you're having in the essay. You might find that you're not sure about the meaning of particular words or phrases. And of course, there are different techniques you could use to make sense of them.
Oh, can you share some of
So I
those
can suggest a few, you
techniques?
might think of others. So if it's, for example, a concept or a case that you're struggling with because you're not confident about your understanding of it, sometimes, of course, it may be a matter of simply going back to, say, the textbook and looking up the concept or the case. Uh, the standard textbook may well have an alphabetical table of cases at the start you can use to find the pages or paragraphs where a case that may be mentioned in the title is discussed. The index
Mm,
at the back, of course, may indicate where a particular concept is discussed. So that could be a starting point. Sometimes, of course, if it's a quote from, say, a judge or a law professor, there might be some legal jargon in there. And it might be useful, say, to use a law dictionary simply to make sense of uh, what that means. So there are some practical
mm,
things that you can do to make sense of some of the more difficult parts of the title. But there may also be parts of it that may be deliberately ambiguous because what the tutor is hoping you'll do is to point out that this could mean different things and perhaps to say what it depends on. A bit like if you're answering a problem question where you're advising people.
Mm,
Sometimes, of course, the facts are ambiguous. It may not be clear exactly what happened. And the students probably know in that situation what you do, of course, is to say, well, it depends. If this is what happened, then my advice is this. However, if this has a different meaning, it could mean this, my advice would be different, and this is why. So
mm.
you could adopt a similar approach for ambiguity in the title when you notice that. There's
I
just a
mean,
few starting points really for
that very
making
very good
sense of it.
starting points, I think, for anyone. I mean, understanding the question in terms of language. You know, we have international students as well. I mean, for personally, I have a different native language, so words might mean different things. But
Mm,
uh, understanding the words of a question or the words in a quotation or whatever the case may be. I think that's one of the things that we might move on to. You know, what if we're talking about a quote here? So understanding the words as well as the words in the context of the topic that the question
mm.
is set in is very important. I think an inquisitive student would actually ask the question in class, wouldn't they? Would you like us, Mr. Tutor, Mrs. Tutor, to talk about X, Y, or Z? And
Mm.
sometimes it's painful because you can't answer that question. It's the way it is said. I always say
Yes.
to students, ask the questions as much as you can, but very often you might not be able to get any answers because it is set in that way that everyone is
Mm.
but I think some tutors do give further guidance, don't they, in a conversational way in class from
Yes,
their
yes, I think that's right.
experience.
As yes, exactly as you say. Yes, sometimes, as you've described, students ask questions which feel to the tutor like it's effectively asking, "What should I say? What should my structure be?" Which is a sensible
Yeah.
question for the student to be asking. But unfortunately, to the frustration of the student, not one that we can tell them an answer to,
Yes,
very often because that's what we're assessing their ability
to
to
do.
work out. But yes, it doesn't mean that we can't give some general advice or we can't talk about perhaps ways of working out what the
Yes.
title is asking someone to do,
So
even
what
if
we're
we can't.
telling students
Yeah,
is really ask the question. You know, if you don't get an answer, you know, don't be upset about it. Don't take it personally, but don't be shy to ask a question if something is not clear. I think
yes,
that's really.
absolutely. Yeah,
Oh, but what
yes,
about quotations? Yeah, what if we have a quote?
yes, very good question. I think the temptation with quotes sometimes is to see them as decorative, if you see what I mean.
Yes,
I think that's just like sort
yes.
of adding a bow, as it were, tying up the essay in
Mm,
a bow or adding wrapping paper to it that you take off, and the
yeah,
instruction
yeah.
underneath is the real question. So
Mm,
that's a mistake that sometimes is made to avoid. So my first thought is to suggest to people that you treat the quote as part of the essay title. It may seem obvious to say it, but the quote is there for a reason, and even though it may be confusing or not easy to understand, it's usually there to try to give you some ideas or some clues about your structure, about what you'll be focusing your essay
mm,
on. So, what to do with a quote? Well, a bit like the rest of the title, sometimes it could help to reword it in your own words to test how well you've understood it and to sort of see for yourself what it means. To put it in language that makes sense to you. And as part of that, you may be looking to see, are there any particular claims or opinions
mm.
in that quote that might be starting points for the discussion in your essay? And of course, you mentioned very sensibly looking at the title in the context of the topic. So in a similar way, of course, sometimes the quote has been made up by a tutor and there's no reference given. But if it's a quote that's actually come from, say, a case, a book, a law journal article, if you can, it's a good idea to have a look at that source.
Mm.
What did the writer say just before and just after the quote that's been chosen? Obviously, only the quote that's been chosen is actually the essay title,
Mm.
but sometimes it can be easier to understand where the quote is coming from if you have a
Well,
look at the
yes,
context
yes,
of
of
the
course.
case, of course, or the journal
Mhm.
article, or the book chapter that it's come from.
And another point I think very good that you highlighted, you have to know the context of it. If you don't
Mm,
know where this quote is coming from, if indeed it is a quote that comes from a judgment, or it could be from a journal article, I don't know. Um, but the context in which it was said, because there might be a controversial point that is addressed in the quote, and maybe the tutor might expect you to take one side or the other, be in agreement or disagree with a quote. So
mm,
the beauty of a quote, I suppose, is that once you get to grips with the historical part of it, its provenance, then you can take a stance yourself. Obviously, we're saying this in the context of knowing your own topic as well. So there is quite a bit of preparation to do before you can um, completely understand the requirement
mm,
of the actual essay question, whether or not it includes a quote. So then, how do we structure it? If we, whether or not it is one that includes a quote or not, how do we structure it? I liked that you used the example of a simple essay topic question title. It's we're using it interchangeably because it could be a question, it could be a title, as well as a quote, because now maybe we can give examples as we're talking about the structure,
mm.
perhaps.
Yes. So if we're talking about the kind of essay title which is asking you to discuss or critically analyze something or
Mm.
to respond to a quote, then I think my starting point was that it simply needs the three things that students probably already know that an essay needs to have: the introduction, the main body, and the conclusion. Now, inevitably, that will raise further questions, I imagine, such as what should they have? And obviously, we can talk about those if that would be
Yes,
useful.
yes, yes, please.
Um, but that's at least the starting point that I would have for
Mm.
structure. The other thing I think that's important for me in terms of general advice about the structure for an essay is that for me it's important that the structure is specific not just to the topic, but to this essay title.
Mm.
Because one of the things that can lead to frustration for students is if you've written effectively what would be a good general description of a topic, almost like you were writing a lecture about it or writing a short textbook chapter on it, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
You could demonstrate some relevant knowledge and that would be good. But a student who adopts that approach may not have fundamentally answered the question that's being asked. And the question may not focus on particular aspects of the topic or debates that the essay title is raising.
Mm.
So it comes back really to treating the essay title as giving you hints, giving you ideas about what you need to focus on, and not treating it simply as this is the topic, write me an essay on whatever it, formation of contracts or whatever it might be, defences to a particular criminal offence or something like that.
Mm. Well, that's very good. That's very good. And what would you put in the introduction? It sounds to me like what you're saying is, go straight to the point, but make sure it is about the point, is not just about the topic in general. So, what should be put in the introduction or right
Absolutely,
from the
yes.
beginning? Obviously, we're going to talk about main body and conclusion as well, if we may. But how do we capture the reader or your marker right from the start?
For me, there are three main things that a good introduction includes.
Mm.
One is to explain in your own words what are the issues that you're going to investigate. And hopefully, those issues will come directly from the essay title, including any quote. So, immediately, right from the start, you're showing the person reading the essay this isn't going to be the generic everything I know about separation of powers or formation of contracts or homicide offences or whatever it might be. This
Yes.
is going to be focused on the issues that the title raised, and you
Mm.
show that you've done the work of working out what those might be. That's the first thing. Secondly, and in a way, this is perhaps just another way of doing the first thing, to say something about your structure,
Mm.
almost being like a sort of tour guide to your essays, and on your left, the first
I
thing that
like
you'll
that.
see is a
Yeah.
discussion of offer. And then on your right,
Yes.
further down the road, there is an explanation of acceptance. Further down from that, we'll see that offer and acceptance are not the only things that are needed, because we're also going to
Brilliant.
need consideration or whatever else we might need to form a contract. So taking the reader through what you're going to write, which of course may be easier to write after you've written the essay. So you might want to start the essay with just a very rough draft of introduction and then polish it up at the end after you've written everything. Because of course it's so much easier to say what you're going to write when you
Yes.
know because you've already written it. So
I
that's the
think
second thing.
yeah, I like that you said that, especially that when you are starting off, you have an idea of what you want to write. So it might be helpful for some people. It is to write the introduction. I actually tell my students, and I never do it myself. I never write the introduction at the beginning. It's always at the end
Yes, you
because I
might write the
know it
whole
will
thing at the
change.
end. Yes, because yes, not only might your conclusion vary, but
Mm.
your exact understanding of what are the issues you're investigating might improve as you go back to the sources, as you think it over.
Yes, and then
So,
offer that map as well. Clearly
yes,
offer that map straight at the beginning, like you were suggesting. And what
yes.
about the third point?
The third point, which may be controversial, I wonder what you'll think about this,
Oh,
is to say something about what you aim to persuade the reader to agree with. What's your central argument going to be in response to the essay title?
I
And
like that.
that might be controversial, particularly because people might say, "Wait a minute, my tutor told me not." My teacher's been telling me for years, don't say what you think in an essay, firstly. Secondly, aren't you supposed to be neutral and take into account different views and only include your views at the end? And very often, people studying in school and college have got used to that style. If you haven't, you may not have been writing essays at school or college, but
Yeah.
if you have, very often people are used to almost writing an essay like a judge in court. You hear the evidence on one
Mm.
side, hear the evidence on the other side, and you give the verdict at the end. Perhaps a judge and jury would be more accurate.
Yes.
Uh, but a suggestion which my constant ad tutor gave me when I was a first year student was, in a sense, each essay can start with its conclusion. Where are you trying to go with this?
Exactly. No, I like that. It's a very good point, and I think while tutors say don't write it, in my opinion, we don't say that, to try to stay away from
True. Yeah.
pronouns in that sense. But there's nothing to say that you couldn't say, for example, in the context of a quotation that whether you agree or disagree with it, and trying to persuade the reader to your side of the story or your side of the
Absolutely.
argument. And that third point that you're talking about could involve a sentence starting, however, that
Mm,
you're talking about the quote, however, um, this essay or this paper aims to argue that that is not the case, or some other writers that don't agree or disagree with it. You can make it really interesting, controversial in the nicest possible way within the
yes.
within the legal sphere, and
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
critical writing as well. Critical analysis at the same time. Yes, it does
Mm,
show that you're going to make it interesting for the reader, I think. So
exactly. Yes. Yes,
Very,
and I agree
very
with your
interesting.
point about you wouldn't simply say, I think X. You might use the kind of phrasing you've suggested to simply state something. You might say the better view is. You might say it is submitted that, so you're right, almost like you're an advocate arguing in court.
Yes.
Um, this essay aims to show that kind of thing might be the
Mm.
kind of phrasing you might use to show that
Yeah.
you're trying to get somewhere, to show that you're trying to persuade the reader of a particular response to the title. And for me, that's important because that could be one of the reasons for the sort of discussion type essays why students can get frustrated because you've tried even harder sometimes in the next essay to do the things that you were already doing right in the previous essay.
Mm.
You were already being clear and accurate, and you were already discussing the relevant law. So if you tried even harder to do the things that you were already doing right last time, that
Mm.
may explain why your mark is only 1 or 2 points higher than it was before, because there may be other qualities that tutors look for in the structure of an essay, and you
Mm.
may not realise that that's what we'd like tutors would like you to do.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
that's worth bearing in mind.
Oh, brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you. What about if we move on to the main body of the our essay? Because sometimes I find students struggle with organizing of ideas, organization of points they want to make. How do they do that in a nice, flowy way to make
Hmm,
sure that they're ticking all of the boxes, but obviously it has some sort of logic when your reader goes through it and goes through trying to understand it at the same time, assess
absolutely.
it,
Yeah,
and keep on with the storyline.
yeah. And of course, as you said earlier, you might write the introduction at the end. So the main body of the answer may be the first thing you write, and that can be intimidating, can't it? You're staring at a blank
Yes,
screen and you're
like this
thinking, oh, come
big.
on, I don't know what to do with this. It can be really confusing
Yes.
and frustrating. And obviously, it can be helpful to make a plan. It can be helpful, as I suggested, to reword the title to understand what it means, to look things up if you're not clear about concepts or cases in the title. But beyond a certain point, my suggestion would be simply to pick a day and a time and to start writing. Because
That's a
sometimes for
very good
me,
one.
you work out what goes in the main body as you write it. It's one of those cases where you make the path by walking, if you see what I mean, rather than
Yes.
planning in advance where you're going to go. Um, so sometimes it may help just to say, right, you at this time on this day, I know I won't feel ready. I want to make another plan. I want to
Yeah.
go and read another source, but I'm going to let go of those thoughts. And I'm just going to write something, even if I feel like I'm writing the worst law essay ever.
Mm.
Because sometimes writing that first painful, difficult to write paragraph can be a way to realize, now I start to get more of a sense of where the next paragraph is going. When I've written that, I can see what I need to read to write the next page and so on.
Mm.
So that's my first suggestion. Another suggestion is to be aware of what we do automatically. One thing I really noticed from that sailing course that I did at Rutland Water was how often I would make mistakes because I did things without thinking. I'd do things automatically. So I'd be looking at the wrong thing. I'd be looking at the tiller I was holding to steer the boat, where I was supposed to be looking at the trees to see which way the wind was blowing. And I had to consciously correct myself more than once because I just kept making the same mistakes.
So
Uh,
creating
so
bad
to
bad habits.
exactly, we may have picked
Mm.
up, and not necessarily terrible habits, but one thing I notice that students often do automatically because you've been
Mm.
trained to do it, you've done it many times in the past, is to do what I think of as the traditional school or college approach to writing an essay. What I mean by that is you treat it like a debate. So in the first half of the essay, you've got the points in favor of what the title says. In the second half of the essay, you've got the points against. It's almost like two speeches,
Mm.
as if you're writing both sides of the debate. And in your concluding paragraph, you say which is the better view. and why. Now, that's not a terrible way of writing an essay. It's got its advantages. It's better than only considering one side. And it may be that people listening to this, when I suggested earlier that a good essay starts with its conclusion and you could indicate your central argument in your introduction, some people might be thinking, but surely I meant to consider different points of view. And of course, this approach does consider 2 points of view, which is better than only considering one. I agree. But for me, this approach is a bit too simple for university because, as I see it at least, very often an essay title, that sort of discussion type title, a quote, or simply an instruction, a discussion to discuss a concept or a case or something like that, may well be raising more than one issue to investigate or more than one question to debate. So if I pick on one part of the title and write all of my essay about that, 50% on for, 50% on against, I'm missing out on other issues that the title is raising. Another way in which this, what I think of as this sort of school or college approach, is perhaps too simplistic for university is, if you're looking at this, you're only looking at two possible answers. It's a kind of binary either or. It's yes or no to the title, or it's for or against. And of course, in reality, life can be more complex than that. The possible answers might form a spectrum rather than a simple yes or no, for or against. The answer that you have might be it depends on something, rather than simply yes, I agree, or no, I disagree, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So it's worth considering that the answer may be more complex than simply a yes or no to the essay title.
Mm.
And I suggest organising the main body of your answer around the issues that came from the title, making sure that you've got at least some part of your answer addressing all the significant issues that the title raises. And again, this is a bit like answering a law problem question in a sense. As students may know, sometimes when people get a disappointing mark for a problem question or in advising clients and applying the law to facts, it's not necessarily that you got the law wrong. Sometimes it's that you simply missed out on an issue or an argument that you could have applied the law to and just didn't discuss that. And obviously, potentially, that could be a significant number of the marks that you could have got for that section of the problem that you can't get at all because you didn't even discuss it. And similarly, for an essay title, if there's an aspect of the title, perhaps an issue raised by a quote, which isn't discussed at all, well, there could be some marks that you could be missing out on that might not
Yes.
have, at least some of them might not have been difficult to get. It doesn't have to be perfect,
Yeah,
but
sometimes
that's an
it's
opportunity to discuss the issue there that
yes.
sometimes
Sometimes
people will
it's
miss out on.
something as simple as adding one or two sentences that would have made all of the difference. And I think students don't, sometimes they compare their own work with someone else's, but they only wrote this one paragraph more and they got so many points more than I did. Um,
Yes. People can be understandably very confused or,
yes.
annoyed or, angry about that. I used the cases that Elena did, and Elena got a first and I got, a 2-2. How can that possibly be explained? And often the answer maybe it's about how Elena used those cases
So
and
how
how
could
you
we
constructed your argument.
Yeah, but how could a student check that they are on the right track with their main body? Because obviously we said this is really the main thing that you're writing, and
Mm,
um, we are going to talk about the conclusion as well. But how
yes.
do we know we're in on the right track?
Mm,
What are the signs? We want
yes.
to know. We want to know about the red flags.
Yes, because understandably people worry about, if I start going in the wrong direction and keep going, I'm going to end up in completely the wrong place.
Yes,
So
I
it can be,
always say to students
yeah.
that the beauty of starting your work is starting it. So writing is essential because you've got something to work with, but actually the value comes from rewriting. So don't really
Mm,
get too personal with the paragraphs that you're writing. It's always the rewriting.
mm.
But how do we check that we're on the right path?
Yes, very good point about rewriting. I think that's really helpful. Uh, One thing that may help is when people are having those horrible moments of doubt. Do I take this out? I'm above the word limit. Got to take something out, but I don't know what to take out. And if I take this paragraph out, will I get feedback from the tutor saying, if you discuss that, you've got a higher mark, and they'll be cursing because I had written about that. One thing that may help is to include brief connections back to the title in the text of your answer. So if
Mm,
you're having those horrible moments of doubt when you're thinking, I'm not sure if I'm on the right track or not, is this relevant? One thing that may help is to briefly explain in that paragraph how it's relevant. This shows
mm,
that the significance of this is, or it has been shown now, and then link it back to one of the issues that you're investigating in the title. If you can explain how it's relevant, that's obviously
mm,
encouraging. If you struggle and struggle and struggle to explain how it's relevant and just can't think of a way, possibly that section isn't on the right track, and part of the rewriting
yes.
maybe to work out which issue, sort of refocus on the issue that you needed to investigate in that part of
Mm.
your answer.
So yes, let's go to the conclusion a little bit to make sure that we've covered all three main parts of the essay. What is it that we write in a conclusion for an essay to have maximum impact? We are
Hmm.
about the impact, and I suppose conclusions are quite impactful, as well as the introduction, because obviously you are telling the reader to be persuaded to your line of argument, but then the conclusion is the bow that brings up everything, sums up everything that you've worked on.
Yeah, so hopefully by your conclusion, you've discussed the issues that you aim to investigate. You've discussed more than one point of view, possibly a range of views. It might be a spectrum of possibilities, and you presented the reasons and the evidence, such as cases or academic commentary supporting your preferred view. And so, in your conclusion, for me, it's simply about summarizing and reiterating the arguments that you've already made to leave the reader in no doubt that you've directly responded to the issues that the essay title raises. Just in case
Mm,
their attention was faltering when they're reading your essay. Oh yes, very clear. Yes, good. You absolutely, spot on in terms of your direct connections that you've made with the essay title. It doesn't necessarily have to be very long because otherwise you end up repeating the essay. Uh,
yes.
but for me, that's the most important thing, to summarize and reiterate your response to the issues in the
Mm.
title.
Well, Alwyn, as one of the last things, I mean, I do want to ask you something else afterwards, but are there any mistakes, glaring mistakes that students should really stay away from when they're starting to draft at any point during the writing process, before submission,
Yeah.
whatever the case may be, any mistakes that they should avoid?
Yes, I can suggest three that come to mind that are often made. So it's very understandable, as I said
Mm,
before, like with the sailing course, mistakes that we make without noticing we're doing them. The first is the before I answer the question, I'll discuss something else mistake. And literally, sometimes in essays, I've seen somebody write, before I
mm.
address the thing the essay title is about, I will first explain. I'm thinking, well, I know that's part of the topic, but why are you doing that? Just answer the title. You're effectively taking up potentially a quarter or a third of your essay, and you haven't
Yes.
yet started addressing the issues raised by the title. So if you find yourself
Yes.
doing that, now, I appreciate that sometimes the history or the context may be important, but bring it
Mm,
in where it's relevant in the way that you're responding to the issues in the title. If you're tempted to write an essay that starts in the year 1805 for an essay about the law in the 2020s, unless there's some
yeah.
particular reason for doing that, probably want to start in the present day, or at least relatively recently, because maybe there's a way in which the law moved on, and perhaps sometimes explaining the last change in law can be a way to explaining what it currently is. So that's the first thing. The second mistake to look for is the everything I know about the topic answer, which is probably the obvious one that people come to mind. which understandably is often the result perhaps of just worrying about what the title is asking and not being sure about that. So if you find yourself just trying to put in everything you know, the danger of that is it becomes very superficial. Everything
Mm.
is in there, so
And
nothing is in there in any depth.
but also too descriptive. Very
Mm,
often, the too descriptive is noted by tutors, just because you don't really get to the point and
exactly.
involve that critical analysis either. If you're talking about just everything you know about the topic.
Yes, spot on. Um, so three things to look for. Firstly, before I answer the question, I'll tell you about something else. Secondly, I'll tell you everything I know about the topic. And the
Hmm.
third one is one that I realized when I read a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by a psychologist, Daniel Kahneman, who investigated how people make decisions. And he
Mm.
identified something he calls the substitution effect. And the substitution effect, just to simplify it a bit, is this. If we are asked a complex question, what we often do is to replace it with a simpler question and answer that instead. So, I think one of the examples he gave was if a psychologist is asking you, how happy have you been in your entire life? What people will often substitute that with is, how happy are you feeling right now? And they'll answer that question instead. So, literally, you get the same people and show them a series of happy videos or sad ones, and they give you a different answer about the question, how happy have you been in your entire life? Because the question they're actually answering is, how happy do I feel right now? And it's a thing that we don't notice, but we can easily do when writing a law
Mm.
essay, because very often for a topic there's the standard textbook question. So, for example, in Constanad in the first year, the standard textbook question about the separation of powers is, does the UK Constitution have a separation of powers? Whereas if the essay title, to use a recent example at the time of recording this, is more about, do we have a separation of powers because judges believe we have one? And does the fact that judges believe that we have a separation of powers actually preserve the separation of powers by itself? Well, that's a different question. So if the essay title is asking about the role of judges, but I'm answering the question, does the UK Constitution have a separation of powers? I'm
Mm.
missing the point. And it's one of the most common ways in which students can get a disappointing mark for an essay. Um,
Yes.
it's an unconscious process. We don't realize we're doing it. It's very human. It's very understandable. So it comes back to your point earlier about rewriting. So when
Mm.
you're rewriting, very good advice, it's worth checking, which issues am I actually investigating here? Am I still focused on the title, or am I effectively slipping into the kind of standard textbook debate, or the standard debate that everyone has about this topic, which may not necessarily be the same issue as the issue that the essay is about?
I like how you said that. You're actually tapping into every student into the idea that every student needs to start getting to know themselves and how their brain works as well, because very often even proofreading, the proofreading exercise of going through your own work is a tedious thing, because most of the
Mm,
time your brain will read whatever it wants to read, not exactly what is on the paper. And I say that to students, print it out, read it out loud, do it differently to how you've done it before, because very often you will not realize that we are so, um, our brain is so well equipped in making its decisions without asking you. If I can
very good
say that,
point. Yeah.
like that reaction, that sometimes we don't question it and we just run
Yes.
with it.
Yes, and I make that mistake all the time.
Oh,
I've
we
written
all do.
something, but when I look at it again, I see what I intended to write and not what I literally don't see my own mistakes. So
Yes,
sometimes
yes,
it can be worth leaving it for a few days so I don't remember well enough what it's supposed
yes.
to say to be able to see the mistakes. A student gave me a useful tip. One of their parents was a professional proofreader, and that apparently some professional proofreaders read things backwards again, because then your brain isn't predicting what you're expecting to see next, and you see what was
Yes.
actually written
Oh, that's
as
very
opposed
good.
to what they were supposed or intended to write.
Very
So
interesting.
So sometimes those kinds of things can help. But yes, checking it over again can be really
Well,
important. And as you
Alwyn,
say,
this is,
reading it out or printing it can make a
yeah.
difference.
This is fascinating. It's really interesting. And I'm glad that we've covered so much. I think one last thing that I may ask, if you don't mind, I don't want you to take too much time on it either, because you've been going through so much material already. But if a student wants to know a place where they could have examples of essays, a good structure, where should they go?
Yes, I can suggest a physical place and some online places.
Mm,
Um, and the starting point for this is very simple. A good law essay, in the sense of a sort of discussion critical analysis essay, has the same qualities, the same strengths as a good law journal article.
mm,
So my suggestion is, for a physical place, simply the law library, where the law journal articles are. And my suggestion
mm,
for online places to look for essays is the legal databases, Lexis, Westlaw, possibly Hein Online.
mm,
Uh, because if you want to see how a law professor would write an essay, what kind of introduction they would use, how they would say what I think is without saying I think, how they would use cases to support an argument, how they would take
mm,
into account different points of view, while at the same time aiming to persuade the reader of their response to an essay title. Have a look at a law journal article. Very likely your lecturer for a module will recommend some examples.
mm,
For example, there may be journal articles in the recommended seminar reading. There may be recommendations of journal articles at the end of textbook chapters and the chapters that you're asked to look at for seminars, for example. So those might be a good place to look
mm.
as a way just to see what good law essay writing is like, including a particular structure.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for this, Olwyn. I hope the students have enjoyed it as much as I did. I know a couple of things more now. You always learn. So yeah, very much appreciated. Thank you for your time, and maybe we'll see you some other time for another question. Maybe there will be
Yes,
follow-up questions from other students.
yes, happy to talk some more. Thank you very much for setting up this series, and I hope it will be useful for
Wonderful.
people.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.